Hi, I'm Michel Taddei, double bassist for the Left Coast Chamber Ensemble, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about George Crumb and his longtime posthumous collaboration with the poet Lorca, Federico Garcia Lorca, and in specifics about his Madrigals, Book One, which we performed at Left Coast Ensemble, and also why is it that George Crumb, not completely uniquely, but um, he's in a very small handful of contemporary composers who've actually captured the public imagination and is much appreciated by the public. So I'd like to talk about a few of these things today. Well, let's start off with a little background information. So Federico Garcia Lorca was born in 1898 in Granada in Spain. He was a very talented pianist. His father forbade him to study music, but when he went to university, he wasn't much interested in his academic work and was just writing all the time. So he met many of the poets who became known as the generation of 27 radical poets, including Jorge Guillén, Pedro Salinas, and Emilio Prados. And he also socialized with Manuel de Falla, the great composer. He knew the filmmaker Luis Buñuel and developed a particularly close friendship with the artist Salvador Dalí. And of course, the last two figures, Buñuel and Dalí, are very well-known surrealists. This was to be an element as well in Lorca's poetry. Lorca did study in the U.S. for a little while in the early 30s. He took some classes at Columbia University, but he returned to Spain in 1936, was arrested on the orders of right-wing authorities in Granada, and he was assassinated at the age of 38. Even though he, of course, was a very young man when he died, he had already produced an incredibly important body of work in terms of poetry and plays. So George Crumb actually found out about Lorca's poetry 2 decades later when he was studying for his doctorate at the University of Michigan. Another student had set the Casita del Herido por el Agua, and Crumb was just blown away. I assume he probably liked the other composer's work as well, but he was blown away by Lorca, and he loved how Lorca would blend surrealist things with the traditional Andalusian style. So it was something that felt very organic and real. So Crumb had said about his collaboration with Lorca, "I have sought musical images that enhance and reinforce the powerful yet strangely haunting imagery of Lorca's poetry. I feel that the essential meaning of the poetry is concerned with the most primary things: life, death, love, the smell of the earth, the sounds of the wind and the sea. These ur-concepts are embodied in a language which is primitive and stark, but which is capable of infinitely subtle nuance." And more about that later. We'll see how that sort of impression that he had of Lorca's style, he brings out through specific compositional techniques in the Madrigals. And so, in terms of a collaboration, Crumb, some people call it a cycle, but Crumb's connection to Lorca's settings, it spans over 50 years. So he, in 1963, composed Night Music 1, but then went well into the 21st century to his 3 volumes of Spanish songbooks. There are madrigal sets, fragments from, so the madrigals sets fragments from several Lorca collections, including Divan del Tamarit, and I'll go into some detail about that poem later, Poema del Cante Hondo, Primeras Canciones, and the play Bodas de Sangre. And those are from 1934, 1931, 1936, and 1932, respectively. Crumb had given an interview to a person writing specifically about these works and the Lorca collaboration, and he'd met with Lorca's family, and Lorca said that with all the composers who've set Lorca's work, they felt that Crumb's settings came the closest to capturing the spirit of Lorca's poetry, and they considered it to be the best. That pleased George Crumb a great deal. So the majority of the Lorca cycles were written between 1963 and 1970. After that, for about 16 years, Crumb left Lorca behind and even thought he was done with Lorca. Crumb wrote, "At one time, I thought, after Aged Voices, I'm never going to write another Lorca piece. I've done all I can with Lorca, so these other compositions came along as postscripts almost. He also writes, in Ancient Voices of Children, as in my earlier Lorca settings, I have sought musical images that enforce and reinforce the powerful yet strangely haunting imagery of Lorca's poetry. I feel that the essential meaning of the poetry is concerned with the most primary things: life, death, love, the smell of the earth, the sounds of the wind and the sea. As I was saying before, it's very connected to these concepts. Now, about Lorca, in terms of being very connected to these elemental things, some people have said it's best described as falling into the realm of duende. And duende is very difficult to define, but it's very much at the core of what Lorca does. Crumb describes it as passion and élan, bravura in its deepest and most artistic sense. In 1933, Lorca gave a lecture entitled Teoría y Juego del Duende, Theory and Play of the Duende, in which he explored the idea of duende and ideas of beauty and creativity. So duende was well known throughout Spain in Lorca's time, and his fascination with cante jondo and folk music, and the folk people who performed it, came from this awareness of duende in the art. Lorca quoted Manuel Torres saying, "All that has black sounds has duende." He also referred to Goethe's description of Paganini, explaining that duende is the mysterious power that everyone feels and that no philosopher can explain. And so Lorca tries to find something a little more tangible. He says, duende is a power and not an act. It's a struggle and not a thought. I've heard it said by an old guitar master, the duende is not in the throat. The duende comes up inside from the soles of the feet. That is to say, it's not a question of ability, but a real living style. That is to say, of blood. That is to say, of ancient culture, of a creation act. So this is kind of where Crumb and Lorca are coming from, very much kindred spirits in this regard. And let's look a little bit about how this comes out in the piece. So Madrigals Book 1, it's scored for soprano, vibraphone, and double bass. And the three movements of the book are, number 1, verte desnuda es recordar la tierra, which is to see you naked is to remember the earth. Number 2, no piensan en la lluvia y se han dormido. They don't think of the rain and they've fallen asleep. And the third one, los muertos llevan alas de musgo, and the dead wear mossy wings. So we're going to specify the second one about la lluvia, about the rain, and it's interesting the way it's set in that the music, the text doesn't actually come through 100%, and it's just a fragment of the poem that captures the essence of the poem. The poem, in fact, is something quite dark and heavy. The earlier stanza talks about how along the groves of the Tamarack, the leaden dogs have come to wait for the branches to fall, to wait for them to break themselves alone, all about death. And then in the last stanza, he writes, along the groves of the Tamarack, there are many children with veiled face waiting for my branches to fall, waiting for them to break themselves alone. So we're in the middle stanza where they're not even thinking about the rain, they've fallen asleep, the children have no idea about the impending doom, and basically this fragment, this moment, is something that is captured by Crumb in a very specific sort of style, that you really get the sense of the actual sound of rain. There's a lot of pointillistic effects. The sorts of sounds that that we make will be sul ponticello on the double bass, just barely voiced phonemes from the soprano, not always using the text, using different sorts of mallets and harmonics on the vibraphone, and then a sort of chromaticism that is really enveloping and gives you the sense of we hear rain. these are perhaps dreams in the rain. And the bass and the vibraphone manage to go through all of the 12 tones of the chromatic scale before the soprano does. And when the soprano finishes with the text, it's the first time that she actually says the entire text in the entire piece. Before then, it's all fragments. So again, it's very dreamlike. It portrays these children who have no idea of what's coming, and does it in this remarkable way. So again, the techniques on the vibraphone, playing with the fingernails, mallets, a light triangle beater, double bass, playing ponticello glissandi over harmonics, pizzicato also with harmonics, collegno, which is when you take the bow and beat it on the strings. There are also percussive effects that happen when I hit the instrument itself. So it's quite a remarkable piece. I can't really go into too much more detail about it, but because there's only so much time, and a lot of it's very technical. But do listen for those things when you listen to our recording. So anyway, just to come back to this idea of why is it that George Crumb is such an appealing composer to us, even though he's writing very much in this avant-garde style. He's writing in an atonal style. He's not writing what would seem like easy listening music. And what I would put out there possibly is that this connection to things that are really elemental and essential are things that just speak to people. So he had written himself about music since the atonal period of the Viennese composers. It's been the widespread use of a few tiny pitch cells, and he describes them, and he says that these cells in various permutations, along with a few other basic types, are astonishingly prevalent in contemporary music of whatever style. He uses this, and he uses atonality, but does it in a way that would be more appealing to people. He writes as well, perhaps many of the perplexing problems of the new music could be put into a new light if we were to reintroduce the ancient idea of music being a reflection of nature. Although technical discussions are interesting to composers, I suspect that the truly magical and spiritual powers of music arise from deeper levels of our psyche. I am certain that every composer, from his formative years as a child, has acquired a natural acoustic, which remains in his ear for life. The fact that I was born and grew up in an Appalachian river valley meant that my ear was attuned to a peculiar echoing acoustic. I feel that this acoustic was structured into my hearing, so to speak, and the ocean shore endless plains would produce an altogether different inherited acoustic. So actually, the pieces he wrote to finish his doctorate, Diptych and Variazioni, both incorporated folk songs, hymns, and instruments from his native Appalachia. And Crumb's parents were musicians. They both played in the Charleston Symphony Orchestra, but they were also old-time music players on the side. So very connected to this folk tradition, much as Lorca was as well with Cante Hondo. I think another element that makes Crumb so appealing for people is his theatricality. And this goes along with Lorca as well. This is such a thing. So, for example, the Pulitzer Prize-winning orchestral piece, Echoes of Time in the River, has an altered stage plot to allow processions across the stage. In Ancient Voices of Children, the soprano will sing phonetic songs into an amplified piano, and the performers are asked to speak, whisper, and yell at various points, which we did in the Book 1 of Madrigals. In 1970, inspired by the Vietnam War, Crumb also published Black Angels for electric string quartet, and they're also expected to play percussion instruments. And hearing that piece inspired David Harrington to form the Kronos Quartet. Another piece that we have done at the Left Coast Ensemble is Vox Balanai, which involves as much blue lighting as possible, the wearing of masks, and all sorts of very evocative sounds, which were inspired, in fact, by a recording that he heard a whale song. So this is the kind of thing that it's not just about chromaticism. It's not just about being avant-garde. It's got a human quality to it that really resonates with audiences today. And I hope our performance of the Madrigals Book 1 resonates with you. Thank you very much.
Stick.